David Driskell was an amazing man. He died in 2020 from COVID. It's a great loss. This presentation is really a humbling task because the guy was a groundbreaking art historian, along with being a really terrific artist. And he was beloved by many of his students and artists who knew him. So this is the guy in his studio up in Maine. He maintained a studio in Maine during the summers and was down in DC and in Maryland the rest of the time of the year when he was teaching. So I'm just going to hop right in here. Driskell's work's been shown in many exhibitions throughout the country. He's in all the major collections in the museums. There was just a show that finished about 3 weeks ago down in DC at the Phillips. But his work is represented by DC Moore in New York City, and they do shows, you know, often. I don't know when they're planning the next one, but keep an eye out for it, and I'll let you know if I spot it. So let's see. I'm gonna move my thing around a little bit here so I can see what I'm doing. Driskell was a legendary African-American artist and historian. As an artist, educator, and curator, he made substantial contributions to the field that have changed the way we think about American art. His paintings and collages unite a strong modernist impulse with his personal vision and memory. So this is a self-portrait, pretty evolved vision for somebody who was only about 22 years old when he painted this piece. Okay. He was born in Edenton, Georgia in 1931. His father was a preacher. He enrolled in Howard University in 1950, but that's an interesting little story. He showed up at Howard 3 weeks after enrollment was supposed to have happened, and they just let him hang out in audit classes until January came around when he enrolled. So he enrolled in 1950, but that was like, you know, that was a January enrollment. He marries Thelma in 1952, and I believe their first child was born in 1953, and their second was born in 1954. They got right to it. He graduated from Howard in 1955 and received his MFA from Catholic University in 1962. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the instructors that he had there, but, you know, meanwhile, you know, take a look at this kind of scrappy painting here. This is, again, he's 22 years old. This is a pretty, you know, evolved vision for somebody that young. Okay. And these were two of his major teachers at Howard. Lois Jones. Interesting part about this, I was doing the research on this thing, and I was watching Antiques Roadshow last Monday, and up comes a Lois Jones painting on the screen. They you know, basically had a watercolor from her years in Paris, which was really hysterical. I wasn't familiar with Lois Jones's work before that, and there it was. So I was like, someone, I know this person. my wife. Anyway, she was a really extraordinary teacher, and to be a professor, a Black female professor in the 1940s was quite an accomplishment, and she really did. You can see, if you look at this piece, the double portrait from 1950, you can kind of see the influence that she had on him. And the other teacher who was quite a mentor to David Driskell was Porter. James Porter wrote the first book, really. He wrote a book called The History of Black American Artists, and no one had attempted anything quite like that before him. This is really the mantle that he passed on to David Driskell. In fact, in one of the lectures that I heard, or talks from David Driskell, he recounted that Porter gave a class on the history of Black artists in America, and he was the only student. And he gave it like he was giving. He presented the class like he was presenting it to 150 people. Okay. Anyway, this really was something that was had a very profound effect on Driskell. That this was something of a mission that was being passed on to him. In 1953, he receives a scholarship to attend Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Madison, Maine, which is a very prestigious school, and he got a scholarship to go, largely due to Lois Jones. She pushed for him. And he retained a lifelong relationship with Skowhegan because it was such a moving experience for him. And he served as visiting faculty, lecturer, and board member over the years. Okay. I'm going to go through this really quickly. He was assistant professor at Talladega after he graduated from college, associate professor at Howard from 62 to 66, professor of art and chair of the department at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Then became a full professor at Maryland, University of Maryland, from 77 to 98. He also was a visiting professor to a number of different universities over the years. There's too many places to even try and touch on at this stage of the game, but this is kind of a cursory view of his career. He really did use a cross discipline approach. He was both a studio professor and professor of art history. He curated shows. He very, William H. Johnson at the Smithsonian, he guest curated that show. He curated over 35 shows of Black artists, including Romare Bearden, Jacob Lawrence, Alma Thomas, and the list goes on. So it's quite a unique blend of things that come together in this man's career. This piece, Behold Thy Son, was painted the year after Emmett the lynching of Emmett Till. And it's a very powerful piece. You know, a Black Christ is not something you see a whole lot of before this period of time. Okay. So exploring modernist notions about approaches to nature is something which is also part of his practice. It's something that he picked up on being in Maine, really, you know, just that sense of nature and the nurturing quality of being out there working from nature. And again, this is a Colorado landscape from 1960. He did do some traveling across the country, and as I said, he did guest appearances, guest professor gigs throughout the country. So, and the piece on the right is a John Marin watercolor. I believe it's a watercolor. It could be an oil, but it doesn't matter. It's really the modernist notion about integrating cubism and landscape in a very kind of American context. Marin is one of the early modernists, and Driskell would have known his work well, especially Marin spent a lot of time in Maine, and I'm sure that Driskell had seen his work in various shows. Okay. And so basically in 1961, when David was still in graduate school, David and Thelma managed to save up enough money to buy a piece of property in Maine, and they joined a long tradition of renowned artists that summer up in Maine and work from the landscapes. And one of the things I wanted to show is there's a Mondrian tree from 1912, and you can see this kind of the structural stuff that is going on with Mondrian, and the use of that motif in Driskell's work. The pine tree kind of holds a symbolic meaning. It's, you know, this evergreen business for Driskell. It's one of his recurring themes. It really holds a special place in the body of his work. It's Skowhegan and the possibility, the nurturing, the nature coming into his life in Maine. So I will come back to this theme later on in the talk. Okay. And again, back to the Black Crucifixion and Yoruba forms, the merging of African patterns and masks and Western painting and the Western painting tradition melded together in his work. During the summer of '64, he received a European travel fellowship from the Rockefeller and Harman Foundations to visit and study at museums in 9 Western European countries. So he did the museum tour. And I brought up this Grunwald because it really does, you know, relate to these crucifixions, that kind of depth of feeling and the kind of grittiness, the kind of raw quality that's in Grunwald. And these pieces, you know, the interesting part of combining the African mask and the African rhythm and ritual into this Christian approach. It's something, again, that is a recurring theme in his work, in Driskell's work. Okay, still life with sunset. It's really kind of the Western still life, the Matisse, Braque, Cézanne. It's and yet it's very abstracted. It's very rhythmic. So I'm gonna move to this one. And on the right is a Braque still life. And I wanted to put that up next to each other so you kind of see the relationship between what Driskell was doing with this notion of still life and the things that he would have seen when he was at in Paris and in Europe. And again, this is another still life. It's an assemblage. This is actual, pieces of the furniture integrated into the piece. He was very aware of what was going on in contemporary art. So I put up this Rauschenberg Combine just to relate it to what's going on with Driskell's integration of actual object into the still life. Interesting. Okay, and two of his contemporaries, mentors, friends were Jacob Lawrence and Romar Bearden. This Jacob Lawrence, you can kind of see the affinity that the three of these artists share. There's this sense of struggle, of social consciousness of a certain kind. So Bearden was a friend and advisor. You can see the affinity in their work, and the use of collage and mixed media and all of that is really quite clear. Lawrence and Bearden were colleagues. They taught together at Skowhegan. Again, Skowhegan comes into the picture, and they both served on the board there at periods of time. And I'm going to move on to, here we go. Okay, Driskell responded to the turbulent times in his work. He was not a political artist, but the social unrest and struggle were infused in these pieces. Of the I Weep, this piece on the bottom is about as close to a direct response to the Vietnam War and what was going on in the country with the civil rights unrest. This is about as close as you get to in Driskell's work of a direct response to that. Though his fostering of the position of Black artists in the art world was very much a part of that struggle, and that in certain ways rather than becoming more politically radical, he was able to champion Black art in a way that is of great service, and you know, that really, I think the fact that his father was a preacher, there is an element of that mission in his work as a curator and his work as an artist and educator. Okay, and this piece was done after his visit to West Africa. He toured Senegal, Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria in 1969. And this piece was something where he's starting to really integrate the African mask and the motif into his kind of gritty cityscape pieces. His contribution to our evolving view of art and culture in America is still resonating. The landmark exhibit Driskell curated, 2 Centuries of Black American Art, in 1976, broke attendance records in many of the museums that hosted it as it toured the country. Okay, the show had a profound effect on many artists of color at the time, and it was very controversial. There are a number of museums which did not want to show the work. There was actually the Museum of Fine Arts in Chicago did not want to touch it at that time, which is crazy, but hey, things change, thank God. But there's some things about this image, this Ghetto Wall piece, which is really interesting. This dark figure, this faceless figure, which is something that is picked up in a number of contemporary artists that are working now about the idea of the Black artist coming into the museum context at this stage of the game, and how faceless people of color have been in the museum context. Interesting notion. And here is a shot of part of that installation at the Los Angeles County Museum. And basically, it went from there to the High in Atlanta, to the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, and then it finally ended up at the Brooklyn Museum. It took various forms at different times. And one of the things, there were, I can't remember the numbers of artists. There was something like 40 artists, 40 something artists in the show, 34 of which were male. So there weren't very many women artists that were represented in the show, which is something which probably would be different now, but he did champion a number of really great artists, and I'll talk more about that too. So Driskell participated in a lot of groundbreaking exhibitions. He contributed an essay to this Harlem Renaissance show, which took place in 1994 at the Studio Museum in Harlem. But let's move on here. Okay, back to the pines, and back to this repeated return to nature as a place of solace, as a place of strength. So this is a picture of David Driskell hanging out outside of his wonderful little studio up in Maine. Okay, Woman with Flowers, 1972, Oil and Collage. Okay, so Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, of course, is a old African American spiritual. Driskell considered Christianity essential to his upbringing, which he mixed with African spirituality. He frequently turned to spiritual and mythological themes in his work. Self-portrait. So this is again the bringing together of East and West, the bringing together of his ancestral heritage. This building with porch is part of a center, a center in Africa that he visited. Driskell made several research trips to Africa and brought back information. And actually, he was teaching African art history and the history of the West at the same time. And many students, actually, it was kind of controversial in a certain way for some of the faculty at Howard. He was teaching these classes in art history and teaching studio classes, and he was such a draw that he didn't hold a doctorate, but he was teaching many of the graduate level courses at Howard in African American art history, which is really interesting. And he had a huge following, and people came to the school just to work with him. So again, the integration of the contemporary and the kind of motifs from Africa. Okay. This is a really interesting piece, Memories of a Distant Past. The title speaks for itself, but there's this transparency and translucence in the piece. The implications of kind of other dimensions, this ancestral presence, this kind of depth that he's trying to portray in the piece. Notice on the bottom edge, there's this kind of calligraphic Islamic text mixed into the thing. Interesting pieces, interesting notions. Okay, homage to Romar Bearden. It actually, if you know what Romar Bearden looks like, just remember what this looks like, because I have a picture of Romar Bearden in a couple of slides, but it looks a lot like him. Beautiful piece too. Really interesting. Okay, Sweet Music, homage to Dizzy Gillespie. This business of homage, this abiding respect for the creative muse, the references to other artists and other art forms. You know, Night Vision for Jacob Lawrence. Again, the acknowledgement. And here we go. On the upper right is Romar Bearden. So you might be able to remember what that piece looked like, and see what I mean about there's certain similarities to that mask-like face in that collage piece. So on the upper left is Driskell with Alma Thomas in 1966 at a show. I believe this was at Fisk, where Driskell was at that time teaching, and this was a show devoted to Alma Thomas's work. Now, I could be wrong about where this is. I can't remember now, but I know who they are. And they were both graduates of Howard, so they had, you know, I mean, Alma Thomas graduated much earlier than him. She actually was one of the first graduates of their art program out of Howard. Okay, and below we have Jacob Lawrence in the white, and David Driskell standing next to him. So these guys were I believe they were the board of Skowhegan at that time. Okay, but these people were very important to him. David Driskell was very close to these people, and they all interacted a great deal. And here is on the right is a piece by Alma Thomas, one of her abstractions, and on the left is a David Driskell, and you can see that there's some degree of relationship that was formed there. You know, Alma Thomas said, "Don't worry about all that political stuff. Just paint." And these are a set of pieces by Driskell around 1980, and you can kind of see, you know, allowing himself to go a little bit more abstracted, but it still has that kind of radiant landscape notion. There's also this kind of graffiti-like calligraphy, this sort of Islamic calligraphic form that's kind of integrated into this summer heat. Beautiful pieces too. Okay, and Shaker Chair and Quilt is sort of an homage to Driskell's mother. She was a quilt maker, and it's sort of a crazy quilt, but you know, it's also the kind of acknowledgement of the kind of quintessential American culture that he was operating out of. And
Larry,
yes,
it says it's in caustic and collage.
Okay,
caustic.
Great, good question. Thank you. So encaustic is actually a wax medium. What happens is you melt wax and mix pigment into it, and you paint it on when it's hot, and it dries on the surface. So, and collage is just cut paper, ripped paper, and that's integrated into the encaustic. So the wax will act as an adhesive too, and so the paper and the paint, the wax paint, are integrated into each other. It has sort of a luminous quality to it because it's thick and yet semi-transparent at the same time. So you can kind of see through it. It's got a rich quality to it. And this is part of Driskell's roots too. He actually learned at Skowhegan. He worked with a guy by the name of Beaucourt, who was a paint maker, who actually taught him to how to grind paint and mix his own paints. So this is something which was part of his practice throughout. So good question. Thank you for asking. Okay. And again, this is Musician as an Angel. The face on this angel looks a bit to me like Charlie Parker. So bird as an angel, very interesting notion. I think that really is. I think that's what it is. I mean, that face does look a lot like the Charlie Parker that I know. And the whole idea of jazz as a very abstract form, loose, kind of like you drop off the melody and keep the chord progression. It's kind of how the improvisation takes place in jazz. So the piece on the right with the fall colors is kind of a play with forms. You know, drop off the direct reference to nature and keep the colors. Interesting notion. I don't know. Just putting it out there. And again, this business of patterning and rhythm and this kind of dimensionality that he's playing with, and you know, constantly experimenting with different media and different ways of putting things together. So this is acrylic and collage, and this one on the left is oil and collage, so that they have very different viscosities. The paints have a very different quality to them. So that, you know, this is always something which stimulates his creative juices, you know, gets them moving. Ancient alphabets. Okay, and this is a serographic series that he did. They're relatively small. It's 15 by 11, and there's about, I think there's 12 in the suite of these. The interesting part is he had done some. I couldn't find any really good reproductions of it, but he had done some stained glass windows for a chapel at Talladega University, which is one of the places that he taught at one point. But these reminded me so much of stained glass, and this is several years after that commission, but they just reminded me so much of stained glass. Really loose for prints, for, you know, they're really nice painterly prints. Okay. And we're getting toward the end here. Again, in Caustic Integrating, you know, you see the piece on the left, Church Roll On. You know, there's this angel up at the top, floating over the top of the old church kind of funky thing. Really interesting pieces. And again, encaustic, wash, crayon. And there's the man in the studio in 2004. You can see how he would work. He'd work on a bunch of pieces at the same time. You know, the pieces in the middle on the wall behind him are kind of, they're on pieces of canvas that hadn't been stretched yet. And then the other pieces that are on the wall look to me like they're on paper. Delightful man, just a delightful human being. I mean, you know. And In Search of My Mother's Art, #2, from 1992, oil on unstretched canvas. And you can see this kind of crazy quilt pattern. Really interesting. I love this nutty sofa. It's really just this wild, wonderful, joyful thing. Okay. And you know, the woodlands, his beloved trout stream. He had a trout stream on. He has a trout stream on his property that he used to go out and fish in. But again, this business of back and forth between the engagement with people, with myth, with the kind of contemporary issues and kind of archetypal history, history of the ancestors comes into the work. And here's the man. So there's a really wonderful lecture with him. It's an interview with him at Colby College. So it's a conversation with David C. Driskell from 2017 at Colby College. It's about an hour long, well worth the trip to listen to. And then there's Black Art, The Absence of Light, the HBO special, which is actually inspired by David Driskell's landmark 1976 exhibition. He is in that special. I mean, I can't say enough about this guy. He's the recipient of the Medal of Arts and Letters, and he's just an incredible human being. I wish I'd gotten the opportunity to meet the man. So that's it for this presentation.
This was wonderful. Does anyone have any questions? Please put them in the chat function. I think you were pretty, you talked about him in depth, so yeah, that would be pretty hard. He was an interesting guy, and he's a very kind face, so I could see why you would have liked him.
Oh,
so,
he's a great guy. When you actually hear him talk, it's like he was a charming human being.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. Larry, if you would stay on and see if we could talk afterwards.
Sure.
Sometimes it doesn't always work, but thank you all for coming.